Okay, welcome back, class. We are now moving off indirect and direct financing, loans, stocks, and bonds, and we're moving into actually a very popular topic, economic growth theory. And why is it so important? Well, it's really important to all of us because it introduces so many better products, new products for society, and at a cheaper price. So let's take a look at it and see what folks thought of it and what makes it up. Okay, so when we're looking at economic growth, we want to take the percent of real GDP per capita and see how it has changed. Okay, so remember, taking real GDP, we are taking the inflation factor out of GDP, and we want to see how many folks were involved in it, so we divide it by the number of people in the country, so that's per capita, all right? And unfortunately, it's not always going to go up. Most of the time, yes, it does go up, but economic growth can stay stagnant, as we were about to talk about for some countries, okay? So, when we go back in history, I know your book takes it back to the time of Jesus Christ, and we look at this chart. It's when I first saw it many years ago, it was actually kind of startling when you look at it. You say this is real GDP per capita, and this is the timeline going all the way back to the time of Jesus Christ. Now, when we look at real GDP per capita, it is so low, and it stays low. As a matter of fact, it even dips, roughly around the Dark Ages from, let's say, 500 AD to 1300 AD. As we say, they didn't call them the Dark Ages for nothing. And what happened then? Well, during the Dark Ages, we had these little kingdoms, we had feudal wars, small kingdoms were fighting each other. And what happens? Well, you're fighting each other all the time, and training, commerce, and trade, are just left behind, all right? So we had a bad situation. It did not get any better. But look, the incredible amount of time. We're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, actually thousands of years, when this real GDP per capita was so low, we call it subsistence living. In other words, the vast majority of people were just getting by. They were just making enough, barely enough to eat, and in many cases, not even enough to eat. So we had folks starving to death or on the verge of starving to death, getting worse during the Dark Ages, but remaining flat, got a little bit better during the Renaissance, slightly better. But then look, what happens? My gosh, in the mid to late 1700s and in the 1800s, it starts to really, really take off. And then, coming to now, this real GDP per capita just skyrockets. Well, what caused this? And obviously, it's a good thing. We're not, having, majority of people living barely above the line of starving to death, all right? So, we look at it and say, okay, well, in the mid-1700s, we had what we termed the industrial age. Machinery started doing things that was always done by hand. It could repeat. It was much more productive. Things were getting better, better and better and better. This is all part of economic growth. Now, when we want to take the percent change of nominal GDP, we take it, again, to find economic growth, take what did nominal GDP do, and we subtract the price level, the inflation rate, and then we take out the change in the population, and that gives us our economic growth, okay? So, for instance, if nominal GDP went up by 5%, which which wouldn't be all bad. We say, okay, let's take out the increase in the price level, and let's say it was 2. So that would take 2 out and then increase population 1. So we have a real economic growth rate of around 2%. Now in your book, and this will be a useful tool for you further on in life, when you're looking at interest rates and what something is going to generate for you, and you think, oh, how long would it take me to double my money? And that actually, that rule of 70 is quite a useful tool. So what happens is you take whatever interest rate you're getting on whatever financial instrument it is, a bond, or if you figured how much a stock is going to go up percent-wise, how many years would it take you to double your money? Now, I used a real simple example here. Let's say we're getting 7% on, let's say, some kind of money market certificate. I know the rates are substantially down now. But if you were getting 7% on your $1,000 and you said, how long will it take me to double my money? The rule of 70 is very handy. All you have to do is you divide whatever percentage rate you're getting, in other words here 7, into 70. And 7 goes into 70, 10. So it would take you 10 years to double your money at 7%. Okay? And if you were getting 10%, well, 10 goes into 70 7 times. So if you're getting 10%, you will double your money in about 7 years. I was using, back in the 80s, early 80s, I was using a 10% factor very often because the rates were up. And so in general, you kind of felt that, if we're doing pretty well, we should double our money, in about 7 years. But that's the rule of 7. That's just something is a useful tool for you in going forward, okay? Now, as we look at this, economic growth, and we say, okay, this was for pretty much the world, staying flat, down, flat, and then finally the Industrial Revolution comes and it goes way up, If we look now at the past 50 years, we say, well, why is it that some countries have grown dramatically and some have grown just a little bit, and unfortunately, a good number of countries, are flat. They're the same as they were 50 years ago, and in a couple of instances, the countries are even slightly worse off. What causes it? What is happening? That's what we're going to look at in today's lesson. We're going to take apart the factors of growth. We're going to take a look at Robert Solow in his early growth theory and what he thought, and we're going to kind of critique, Robert Solow. But again, remember, we're doing this in hindsight, and hindsight is always 20/20. So, going forward, we say, all right, well, what causes economic growth? Well, here, when we're looking at the world, it was the Industrial Revolution. And now we have the information age even taking us even further, okay? But in general, what are the factors of economic growth? Now, you're going to need to remember these because I guarantee this will be an essay question. And I'll give you a heads up. We are going to go through all 5 of them. So if you see anything on economic growth, don't explain the 3 factors of economic growth, explain the 5, okay? Now, first key factor of economic growth, and this one stands to reason. This is the one that most folks, come to think of. Well, it's the resources, all right? Your natural resources, and the big 3 that you always heard about were land, labor, and capital. Now, land typically referred to actually the land itself or the natural resources of the land. All right, some countries are rich in natural resources, some are not. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a slow economy, because look at Japan, for instance. There's a country with relatively few natural resources, but a strong economy. And a glaring example of what economic growth can do and what no economic growth will do for you is that picture of North Korea and South Korea at night. And you see, South Korea is all lit up, and North Korea, it looks like it's got 3 lights on, okay? You say, well, what's the difference? We say, well, in terms of resources, I mean, North Korea and South Korea are pretty much the same area. The resources are pretty much the same. So it's got to be a little bit more. And we will talk about that in just a minute. So under resource, we have land, labor, and capital. Land, again, is the what God has blessed the land with. Also, the climate has to do, some climates are better than others for growing certain crops, so on and so forth. So land is very important. Labor, that is the actual work you and I do, the actual work done, okay? That is labor. Capital, and again, I know we've mentioned this, capital in economics, we are talking about a hard piece of machinery, something you can put your hand on. It could be, again, it could be a simple tool like a wrench or a broom, or it could be an $800,000 machining center, all right? That is capital. That's what we are referring to, at least for our course in economics, capital. In general, think of capital as anything that's going to add to future production, okay? That would be considered capital. And again, it could be simple like a hammer or a broom, or it could be a complicated transfer line or something of that nature. All right, so we had land, labor, and capital, and we had those were the big 3 for the longest time. Then what happened was, back in the 50s, the government wanted a breakdown of what our exports were, what they were intensive in. And naturally, this was in the 50s, relatively not too many years removed from World War II. So let's face it, we were the country that had most of the capital goods. When the study came back, it said that our exports were very labor intensive, and our government couldn't understand that. They said, no, it's got to be wrong. They can't be labor intensive. We are the country of the world that's got all the capital. They've got to be capital intensive. So they did a further study. And what they came to find out was, well, what were we exporting? Well, we were exporting diesel engines. We were exporting jet engines. We were exporting big generators, turbines, all complicated equipment. But, and here's the catch, that equipment required an awful lot of engineering skill and engineering work, which they were labeling under labor. So they said, well, wait a minute, we have to have we're going to break that out into a separate item. So they came up with a 4th one called human capital. And that has to do with the skill set of your workforce. Because the machinery, that these huge generators that we were exporting, all this equipment took hours and hours of engineering work, okay? So that's when in the 50s they came up with the last one, human capital. So these are the 4 resources that we start with: land, labor, capital, and human capital. Now the second one, and that's a big one, and we're going to expand on this quite a bit in a board that's coming up, but basically technology is the knowledge we use basically to be more productive, okay? Either be more productive with current capital, or knowledge that we use to create new capital to even be more productive, okay? So number 2 is technology. Number 3, institutions. Probably the most important of the 5 is institutions. And you say, well, institutions, what is that? Institutions would be the type of government, the type of economic environment that a government provides for its country, all right? Now, we talk about it being probably the most important because institutions can change. If you're rich in resources, or even if your technology is good and you've got some other things that should make you very, very productive, if your institutions are bad, it can change everything. It is as I say, it is a game changer. We look back in the 1950s, Mao in communist China. Well, he had this great plan called the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was Mao was going to industrialize the countryside. Now you have to remember, communist China in the 1950s, they were still struggling. Even the industry that they had located near the towns, they were having their own problems. So now if you try to take industry and move it into the rural areas, you've got a mountain of trouble to try to overcome. And that's exactly what happened with this Great Leap Forward, where they were going to industrialize the countryside. It was a total failure. And this is an example of an institution going bad. It was such a failure that, and you don't read about this so often, but over 30 million people starved to death in the 1950s because of Mao's Great Leap Forward. It would have gotten a lot more press today. That is for sure. Okay? So institutions can make a huge, huge difference. Are we setting the stage, in other words, for our economy to take off, or are we stifling it? Okay, and we're going to see an example in 1 second as I change boards here. All right. Here we have institutions are continued. Now, under institutions, one of the key, most important things in institutions, private property rights. Now, that's something that you and I in this country, we probably don't think of too much because, our property rights are pretty well established. But that's not necessarily true in other countries, and especially throughout the years. It's not necessarily true that you've got private property rights. All right? In other words, these rights give us or allow us to do what we want with our own personal property. Okay? And they need to be, this is important, well defined and well protected. What does that? The government does that. So that's part of this huge phrase, institute, or huge word, institution. All right? Now, just as Mao, Great Leap Forward, was a perfect example of institutions gone bad, there are some examples of great success. Now, we'll go back to the 1920s. Lenin, it's the 1920s, all right? Guess what? People are starving to death. They can't make enough food in the workers' paradise. And Lenin knew, even back in the 20s, Lenin knew something was up, all right? And so what he did, now this is an example of subtly changing the institution and making a huge, huge difference. What he came out and said was, all right, look, I'll tell you what, most of the people had little little areas behind their very small huts or homes, and they would try to grow some crops. So Lenin said, I'll tell you what, if you plant, whatever you plant in your little garden plot in the backyard, we're not going to confiscate it. We're not going to take it. You get to keep it, all right? Now, to you and I, that sounds like that's no big deal. But back in 1920s, communist Russia, it was a huge deal. And Lenin, he took a lot of heat for coming out and saying that, all right? But it was, wow, what a radical idea. If we grow something, we can keep it, okay? And as it turned out, let's see what happened. Well, those little plots of land constituted about half of 1% of agricultural land in the Soviet Union. I mean, you add up everybody's backyard, and it made up actually slightly less than half of 1% of what you would consider agricultural land in the Soviet Union. But that little tiny bit of land, because the people could work it and they kept what they grew, that produced in those years 27%, this is an incredible number, 27% of the total agricultural produce. It saved millions of Russians from starving to death, okay? So this is just an example of changing an institution a little bit, and with the result of a huge impact on economic well-being, economic growth, okay? Hernando de Soto, he was a famous economist, very big in Peru. He was a huge proponent of private property rights. And again, I know you think of, you never think of, you take your car to the store, and if you park it, somebody says, hey, that's not your car, it's my car. It would be even hard to get your mind around that. What are you talking about? It's my car, I own it. Or, if you had a bicycle and you're taking a bicycle somewhere and they say, oh no, that's not yours, it's mine. That doesn't happen in this country. We have well-defined and well-protected property rights. This economist, famous, also said, well, you also need political stability, which certainly helps. I mean, if the government, let's face it, if the government is being overthrown, every year or two, that's not going to add to any economic growth. That's going to certainly detract from economic growth. And certainly, you're not going to get foreign investors to come in and build plants there if they're thinking the government's going to change in 6 months. All right? So, political stability and private property rights, and the free market has to be competitive and open. All right? That means you got a free flow of funds across borders, and you have funds coming in overseas and back and forth. All right? So these are three of the keys under institutions. Okay? But I can't stress to you how important those are, because if you change the institution, everything else, it really doesn't matter. Okay? Just think of the big communal farms that they had in the Soviet Union and how little they were producing. Well, obviously, in the 20s, they weren't producing enough to keep their people alive. All right? Okay, number 4, efficient taxes. And what we mean, again, by efficient means enough to enable the government to secure the funds that it needs for, infrastructure, national defense, the big projects, the big services and goods that aren't well produced by the private sector, okay? But not taxes so high that it stifles or kills industry. So there's that fine line between, you know, generating enough in taxes to let the government operate, you know, smoothly, but not too much to the extent that, you know, businesses are leaving the country, okay? Then the last is stable money and prices. Well, again, you know, we were talking about inflation. Well, if let's say you're a businessman or woman and you're thinking about a major investment, let's say you took out $500 million in bonds to build a plant somewhere, where would you build it? Would you build it in a country that's got an inflation rate approaching 1,000%? No, because you have enough problems trying to establish a new operation in another country without the added problem of the money becoming worth less and less and less all the time, and trying to adjust not only the wages for your employees, but renegotiating prices to suppliers, and consequently coming up with a true, real cost, so you can figure out what the heck your product is going to should be priced out at. So these are the 5 components of that make up real economic growth. Okay, now we're going to look at some of the early growth theories. Robert Solow was one of the early growth theorists, and if we just look at the production function, okay, when we're looking at the production function, that's pretty much a micro term, and that's not hard to figure. I mean, if you've got a business, you say, okay, well, my output, I'm going to base my output on my, you know, my physical capital, my machinery, so on and so forth, and my workforce, okay, the human capital, all right? So it's pretty simple when we're looking at the production function, when we're looking at it in the small view, in the micro view, okay? But this is macro, so in macro, it's a lot more, okay? Now, Robert Solow, he was one of the early growth theorists, and he concentrated quite a bit on this, physical capital. Physical capital was his key. That's where he came up with the theory of the steady state and convergence theory. And we're going to take a look at both and see, and you can see what you think. Some still up for debate, convergence theory, but the steady state theory that Robert Solow presented is not exactly accurate, and we're going to take a look at why. Okay, all right. So first of all, is growth important? Well, is growth important? Absolutely. Look at all the things we have nowadays. Look at in your book. It was comparing, you know, cars from the 1960s to today. I mean, you know, everything's better. I mean, you know, horsepower, fuel efficiency, safety. They have power windows, power steering, power brakes. All those factors go into it. And even when you take in the price, yeah, you say, well, okay, today's cars cost more. But in terms of how long it takes you to purchase that vehicle, it's actually, depending on which statistic you use, it's actually about the same, or it's actually gone down to buy a car, how long it takes you to buy a car. And what a car. I mean, you know, back in 1960, my sisters, they never really learned how to parallel park. Why? Because if you take the picture of that car in your textbook and it has no power steering, that Chevy Impala, which was a pretty big car, and if anybody's ever had no power steering or their power steering go out, try turning the wheel when you're at a dead stop. It's really tough, okay? So, and my sisters weren't big, so to try and turn that wheel, crank that wheel one way and then come back and then crank it back the other way, it was just too much for them, so they never even bothered. They would just look a place where you could just pull in, all right? But what I'm getting at is, the products that way, even though they might be the same, in general product, an automobile, the automobiles are so much better. They're so much safer, so much more fuel efficient, and even more powerful. And I grew up in the heydays, of the muscle cars. But even the cars they have now are, as powerful or more, and they burn less gas. Take a television set. You get this huge, I mean huge, black and white Zenith TV. And you got 4 channels. I don't know, maybe that was better than having 700 channels and still can't find anything that you like. But now, the televisions that are either the same price or cheaper, these flat screens, they do so much more. And typically, they are cheaper, okay? They're cheaper and better. All that's just 2 small examples. Those are the ones that kind of stuck with me, though. Homes, in your textbook, they talk about the home, how much better and bigger the homes are now. So we can attribute all that, to growth theory, and we'll get into some of the other virtues and blessings of growth theory in a minute. Okay, but getting back to our pal Solow, all right, he concentrated primarily on physical capital. So when we started out with this production function, output is equal to physical capital, some function of physical capital working together with human capital. All right, let's bring in Solow and let's say what he would describe it as. Well, Solow would say, okay, output is based on some function, meaning it's multiplied, something done to it, some function of the interactions of physical capital, human capital, and he would put in resources, okay? This was his basic production function. But remember, physical capital was his key, all right? And that's what we're going to see, how it led him to develop the theory of the steady state, okay? Okay, let me move into next board here. I may have to cut this off because I don't want to make any one of these clips too long. It takes forever to load them. All right. Now, here we have output per worker and amount of capital equipment, okay? Now, what Solow would say, and in the book they gave the example of the movie with Tom Hanks when he's on that island, and they talk about, they refer to, let's say, a ladder as his capital equipment, okay? Well, just think, if you were on, and here's how Solow would explain it. You're on the island, and it takes you a week or so to build that ladder. So you lose a whole week or however to build a ladder in order to, harvest coconuts, whatever. What happens? Well, you build the first ladder, and you put it up, and gee, your production has gone up. So it's been a real good advantage for you. So that's what this area would be. These lines, doesn't matter which one you look at now, we'll take the blue one. It's going up really fast. That's your first ladder. And you've got it on the east coast of the island. Well, You think, well, should I carry it all the way over to the West Coast because I'm going through the crop pretty well here, or what should I do? And you look and say, well, you know what? I'm going to build one for the West Coast as well. And you do, okay? Here you are, you're still, your output is really growing. And let's say you continue this on and you build a ladder for the North Coast, the South Coast, and one ladder for the absolute center of your island, okay? At that point, Solow would say you have reached the steady state. There's no point in you adding any more equipment. Now, equipment can get old and broken down, and it needs repair, okay? That's when we bring in the idea of depreciation. It is when an asset loses its value because of use and or just plain old age. Now, what Solow would say was, Hanks will, if a ladder got, really old and fragile, he would perhaps, he's got 5, maybe he replaces one ladder, okay, this year. But he doesn't go further than that, all right, because he has reached the steady state. That's it, okay? Now, if, especially at your age, if you thought the steady state was viable, that would be kind of a depressing thought, to think that, yeah, we've reached the state where, hey, it doesn't get any better than this. And here's how Solow explains it. He says, well, in a general economy, you've got, depreciation. The more you add, it's just a straight line, just going up, which reflects your increasing, capital equipment. Okay, so he's got 5 ladders. He has to watch out for them and maintain them. And if one goes to the point and it's so bad, then he replaces it. All right. Now, but on his output, first couple of ladders really gave him a lot of output, but then it started to taper off. He's getting less bang for his buck. In other words, that 5th ladder, it was good, but in terms of did it give him the big bang that his first ladder gave him, or even his second? No. And it's the law of diminishing marginal return setting in. You get the big bang early, and then it starts to taper off a bit, it tapers off a bit. And at some point, your depreciation is, you're going to be fairly flat, and it's going to hit, your depreciation level is going to hit that output, all right? That point, Solow would say, that is your steady state. You're not going to go beyond it. You're not going to go to the 6th ladder. You're going to maintain what you have. So when one ladder goes bad or 2 ladders go bad or depreciate, you will replace them, but you're going to stay, you have reached your steady state. Now, what this does not take into consideration that we need to think about is the tremendous advancements in technology, all right? If there was no advancement in knowledge, all right, and we were kind of stuck in a rut, as those poor folks were, as we saw at the beginning of the lesson, they were stuck for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Yeah, maybe Solow would have a point, but it is not the steady state, and which is great news for you because you all have your entire life ahead of you. Okay, so even though this line for output may be accurate, and we say, okay, we get the biggest bang in the beginning, and then as we add more and more, it starts to taper off. All right, that might be true, but what we have to remember is this line is not only coming out like this, it is advancing like this. And especially in this day and age, it is advancing rapidly, all right, which is a great, which is great news for all of us, really, but especially for you, because I remember early on when I first heard the steady state, I thought, wow, that sounds kind of depressing. I thought of it as, that's like the boring state. We're going to be stuck at this level and that's it. You know, that's not too encouraging, okay? All right, I may end this video right now and go to the second one because I don't want to make any one of these too long. So I will stop the video now and we'll pick up in the next one.